Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello. Regis Kilbin is the name, and Heroes of the Storm is the game, and this is an expert's take on the Heroes of the Storm action figures. Now, you might know me as a writer for TempoStorm.com, but I'm also actually an action figure collector and expert. I've been working in the industry for a number of years, and this is what my desk looks like at work, featuring prominently some Heroes of the Storm action figures, as you might notice. So I wanted to go ahead and review the Heroes of the Storm action figure line with you, but before I get into all the nitty-gritty details and review each individual figure, first I wanted to just run through a quick overview of the line in case you're not familiar with it. This line actually started last year in 2015 with 5 figures. Up first in Wave 1 were Illidan and Nova. They were followed by Arthas and Tyrael in Wave 2, and then things were closed out in the year with Stitches as a single release deluxe figure. As for the figures themselves, first off, they're really well done. Collectible figures don't get any better than what we're seeing in the Heroes of the Storm action figure line. These are produced by a company named NECA, who's one of the most beloved collectible action figure companies in existence. Unlike the big guys Hasbro and Mattel, NECA's a little bit smaller and caters to specific collector groups with amazing figures like these. The figures have tons of sculpted detail. They're really well painted and have a surprising number of points of articulation, which means they're very posable, so you can get some cool action scenes out of them, and you can even play with them if you want as well. They range from $20 to $25 for the standard size figures, and $50 or so for the deluxe figures, and they're available from stores like Toys R Us or GameStop in some cases. You can also, of course, get them on Amazon or eBay or online toy retailers like that. And I've actually had some luck buying them from the official Blizzard gear shop online. There's nobody better to buy them from than Blizzard if you can. Now that you know what the line's all about, I want to jump into individual figure reviews for all of the figures that were released last year. So before I review the figures, you might be wondering what makes an action figure good in the first place. And to me, there are 3 main categories that define an action figure's quality. Those are sculpt and design, in other words, the physical characteristics of the actual figure itself. Then the paint and the color. So what color is it? Is the paint well executed? Is it clean? Does it match up with your expectations for the character? Does the face look right? And then finally, articulation and posing. These are how many points of movement the action figure has and how easily it can achieve the kinds of poses you might expect that character to have. So with those 3 categories in mind, let's take a look at each of these figures individually, starting out with Nova. So let's take a closer look at Nova. First off, of course, is her sculpt and her design, and it's really all good stuff here. NECA did not skimp on the sculpt. You can see at a high level it looks like Nova, certainly, but there are some great little details. There's grooves in her armor. There are layered armor pieces. It wasn't just lazy sculpting. They went ahead and took the time to mold all that extra stuff. Her legs have the same great details. Just a lot of little flourishes here and there. I will say that her face sculpt probably leaves something to be desired. It just lacks that personality that Nova tends to have. So they could have done a little more there, but in the scheme of things, it's really not too bad for a figure in this scale. Her hair looks good as well. So this is all good stuff. I would certainly give this sculpt probably a 9 out of 10. So as far as the paint and the color are concerned, again, it's really quite fantastic. In fact, I can't find a single flaw on this figure's paint. The applications are clean and clear. The color usage is great. There are subtle variations like the gray on her leg. There are 2 different grays if you look there. The little light blue stripes are a nice subtle difference from the dark blue of the armor. There are multiple colors used in armor pieces, like on her forearm right there. So again, just top-notch paint. In fact, I'd go ahead and give the paint a 10 out of 10, including that face there. You can see that the applications are clean. The lips, the eyebrows, the eyes all look nice and tight. And then finally is the articulation, which I do think is probably the weakest point on this figure. There are plenty of points of articulation, don't get me wrong. There are double jointed knees, we've got single hinged elbows, we've got ball wrists, necks, torsos, and ball ankles as well. Swivel hinges at the shoulders and at the hips. But I will say right now that you need to be very careful with this figure, particularly At the elbows, these joints are very slim, and the peg that attaches the forearm to the bicep is very weak. I've heard of people breaking these, and you certainly don't want to break your figure and have to get a replacement. So do be careful when manipulating the elbow joints in particular. I've also got a little bit of an issue with her hip joint here. You can see that it's not quite flush, this hip in particular. The swivel hinge in there is visible and it's a little disconnected from the hip, so I kind of have to pose around that to make it look exactly right, so that's not ideal either. But otherwise the joints are sturdy and firm, so there's no loose joints. She's going to be easy to pose. As far as her gun is concerned, we should talk about the accessory as well. That uses a peg, as you can see there, to attach to the hole in her hand, which may be visible there. It actually stays quite well, but again, be careful with that peg in her hand just because you don't want to break anything while inserting that gun. And she's able to hold the weight pretty easily, but it is difficult to pose the gun just because of the size of the gun and the small size of Nova herself. So you have to work on a good pose, but there are certainly a few things you can pull off. If not exactly, you know, looking down the scope, at least something cool like on her hip. She just looks like a big gun-toting stealthy assassin that she is. So for the articulation, I'm going to have to go ahead and only give Nova a 7 out of 10. It's just a few things here and there that are limited, and it's somewhat hard to pose her. So that wraps it up for Nova. Overall, a really strong figure. Not the best of the whole series, but Nova fans won't be disappointed, and definitely this is the best representation of Nova that we've ever seen in plastic so far. So now let's take a look at Illidan himself. This is an absolutely outstanding figure in practically every way. I have very few complaints about this figure at all. And it really does start with the sculpt. You can see just how much detail there is in Illidan's face sculpt. So many different wrinkles in his blindfold. He's even got little folds in his ears, you know. His scowl has got a lot of personality and depth. It looks like Illidan. It's all around great. That detail continues down to the muscles, where there are just little striations in all the muscles, as you can kind of see there in his upper body. They're very well defined. He's got just so much detail and depth and personality in his pose and in his upper body. Those details still continue to the legs. He's got like stitches, not just painted but also sculpted right into the side of his pants. Nice fur details down here. His loincloth is a separate piece, so it has some good depth and presence. All around, it's just an absolutely fantastic figure. The warglaives are sculpted well too. They're a little bit thick, you'll note, from the sides. They don't look sharp per se, but that is actually true to the in-game Here's the Storm model, which weapons in the game also kind of have that. So that's more a fault of the game design than of the action figure design. Certainly true to game, but all these details here are not just painted, they're sculpted on as well, so you can see that they really went all out when sculpting this. It also has sharp points, which is somewhat rare for an action figure to pull off. The warglaives fit really nicely in his hands too, so that works out good. So sculpt here is an easy 10 out of 10 for me. It doesn't get much better than this. And as far as paint is concerned, it's equally strong. You'll notice with the glyphs here on Illidan's chest, it's not just like one color they lazily applied. It's 2 layers of a dark green and then this shimmering light green as well. Fantastic color choice there. The base purple is nice. There is a little bit of a mismatch from his forearm to his hand, which might be hard to tell, but this is a darker purple and this is a slightly lighter purple just because of the different kinds of plastic, presumably. So that's not ideal, but it is covered up pretty nicely by the warglaives when he's fully equipped, so it actually is a very minor problem that becomes even less of an issue. As I mentioned before, these stitches are painted on the side of his legs too. That would have been really easy to skimp on. There are some cool airbrushing effects near the bottom of his pants. There is some dry brushing in the fur trim as well. They just went all out. Everything has a nice layer of detail on the paint. The colors are perfect. It just doesn't get better than this as far as paint is concerned. There's like one issue, no slop, it's all clean. So again, just an easy 10 out of 10 for me. So let's talk about the articulation next as we get this out of here, just to show off some joints. We have ball joints at the neck, the torso, the wrists, and the ankles. We've got double hinged knees, So you can see there. We've got hinges at the elbows, which have a pretty solid range of motion. You can push them back to here, and you can close them, you know, not all the way up to the bicep, not perfect 90 degrees, but awfully close. And then swivel hinges at the shoulders and at the hips. So all in all, you know, a fully robust set of articulation, plenty of points. And I will say too that the joints feel fantastic. They're super tight and no loose joints. He's held up poses, even really deep dynamic poses, really well. And the head, despite the hair that seems like it might be restrictive, you can still get a full range of motion on that head for some pretty crazy high personality poses as well. And it all works well with the warglaives. You can pose in some pretty neat ways with the warglaives and like really deep stances. So all those dives and sweeping strikes that Illidan pulls off in game are easy to replicate with a figure. Easy 10 out of 10. All in all, Illidan is about as perfect as an action figure can get in this scale, and the ideal representation of one of the most iconic Warcraft heroes. This figure is basically a dream come true for me. Okay, so up next, let's take a look at Stitches. He is the first and only deluxe figure in the line so far, which means he costs about twice as much as the other figures. But let me tell you, he is absolutely, undeniably worth it. The sheer size and weight of this figure is just enormous. He weighs a couple pounds. He's wider than the other figures are tall. He's about the same height as the other figures, which might seem unusual, but that's actually true to the Heroes of the Storm models. If you look carefully, Stitches is actually not that tall, just awfully fat instead. So as far as the sculpt and design on this figure are concerned, it's unbelievable. It's one of the best sculpted figures in my entire collection, and that accounts for extremely expensive figures as well. There is not a square inch on this figure that isn't just loaded down with absurd amounts of detail. Even the butt, you'll see, has lots of texturing and pockmarks and all this crazy stuff going on. Somebody spent hours and hours sculpting every square inch of this figure, and it really pays off because there's just absurd amounts of detail. The stomach looks fantastic. The weapons are great. You'll see his famous hook here as well. It's just, there's absolutely not a single fault in this figure, and in fact, all of it is just stunning. Including the face there, you can see the eyes have some real depth and personality, as does the mouth, which is always nice to see. Easy 10 out of 10 on the sculpt. In fact, I'd give it an 11 out of 11 if I somehow could. As far as the paint is concerned, I don't know how they did it, but I think they might have made the paint even better than the sculpt. Every little section has so many layers of depth and paint and color. Various washes and brushing techniques are employed. A dozen or 1,000 different colors are used across the entire figure because each little spot has, you know, like this muscle area, like look how many different colors are used in that one area, just a tiny square inch of that figure. So the accessories too got the love on the paint. You can see his cleaver here has little brown stains and blood stains and scratches, and the same goes for the handle, which has all kinds of different washes. For $50, this is just an absolute dream paint job. You never see this level of paint in standard size figures like this, so it's just an easy 10 out of 10 again. Stitches' only real weak point does come when we start talking about articulation, but even then I honestly think NECA did as much as is humanly possible given the style of this figure. He's got a ball jointed neck, his jaw is actually fully articulated, and even his tongue moves as well. You can see it moves from left to right, just depending on how you want it to be angled. So you can get a lot of personality out of his mouth, which is fantastic for Stitches. He has swivel hinges at the shoulders, a swivel at the torso, a hinge at the elbow here, but it's very hard to move. A swivel hinge at the wrist, but again, it's really just a swivel. Swivel hinges at this elbow as well, but also hard to move, and a swivel hinge at the wrist. This one's a little easier to move, but still hardly any range of motion on this wrist at all. As far as the hips go, swivel hinges at the hips, swivel hinge at the knee, swivel hinge at the ankle, and the same goes for this leg as well. But in general, the joints on Stitches are incredibly tight and hard to work with. Oh, I forgot swivel hinges also at this upper shoulder up here, and a hinge at this elbow for his extra hand as well. Back to the joints, they're extremely hard to work with, so you have to be very forceful. Don't be shy when trying to manipulate the joints here. It's unlikely that they'll ever break, but it does make them hard to pose. You really just only get like one standing pose, which you have to work on to make sure you can even stand up in the first place. And then you know, you can move his arms a little bit, just depending on how you want to pose the cleaver and stuff. But really, most of the personality and posing will come out of his head, which is really the most important spot anyway. So articulation, I'm going to have to go ahead and downgrade Stitches to an 8 out of 10, which is a shame just because everything else is so darn perfect. But all in all, this is just a perfect representation of the character and one of the favorite figures in my collection. So don't let the articulation get you down. This guy is worth it in every imaginable way. And then there was Arthas, of course, one of the most beloved and iconic of all Blizzard characters. And as far as I'm concerned, despite all the Arthas action figures and statues that have been made throughout the years, most of which that I already own, this is still to this day my favorite Arthas action figure of the whole set. So what does this do right? Well, it starts with the sculpt, of course. As far as I'm concerned, this sculpt is a perfect 10 out of 10. Not only are there just a million different sculpted details across this entire figure, if you look at stuff like his armor, of course, you'll see that quite quickly. There are just little dents and textures, and the spikes are sharp, and so many different little grooves and details and dents in the armor and scratches, and so much sculpted detail worked into every square inch. But also just the sheer size and depth and layering of the figure all look fantastic. You'll note like his armor, this is all separate pieces to give it some real depth and presence that doesn't always exist quite so easily in action figures. Even sections that you really never see, like behind his cape, this might be a little hard to see with the lighting, but every single square inch is textured like chainmail. It's fantastic. And the inside of his gloves are the same way. There are little stitch marks on his gloves. Every square inch. The helmet also is a unique piece that is glued on top of his head. Mine is actually just a tad crooked. You might be able to tell it sits off to the side just a hair, but it's really quite hard to tell and still does the job and looks right. So Frostmourne is also incredibly well sculpted. It does not have any runes despite being a rune blade, but blame the Heroes of the Storm design team on that fact. Certainly not the action figure in this case. It's true to the in-game design. So he does have a cloth cape, which is worth noting. It hangs quite nicely. Also has some rough edges and some holes added to it as well to represent the in-game model. This is the only the only figure that includes cloth in the whole set so far, but it works pretty nicely for Arthas, and I'm sure we'll see that in future figures where they do have capes as well. So again, 10 out of 10 on the sculpt, without a doubt. And the paint also lives up to the expectations that the sculpt sets. There aren't a lot of colors included in this figure necessarily. It's mainly just the default gray, the gold armor trim, of course the purple of the cape, the brown of the gloves and the boots, but there are so many different ways that it's executed incredibly well. You can probably note the various colors in the boot, where it's a light tan to a darker shade as well, just to give it some depth and some shading. And that exists on the armor too. There's dry brushing across all the different armor pieces to make it really look realistic and give it a slight shine, but still a darkness and a metallic kind of almost evil presence as well. So the paint it's all clean and tidy. I haven't noticed any slop or mess, and so the application and the paint design and the colors chosen are all just about perfect. And then so 10 out of 10 on the paint there as well. And the articulation is a very nice articulation model. In other words, there are a lot of points. In fact, as many as you'd expect with any modern day action figure. The problem is some of them are a little difficult to move just because Arthas's body is so thick that, for instance, his elbows don't bend at a full 90 degrees by any means. The same can be said of his wrists. They don't really have that much rotation. His head you can actually move a fair amount, but you don't need to move it that much. It is Arthas. He's not doing anything too crazy or dynamic. The knees are not double hinges like many of the figures in the set so far. They are a single hinge. The ankles are balls. You got swivel hinges at the shoulders and hips. You actually do have a swivel torso. The lighting here may not be ideal to see this, but a swivel torso, which is the only figure in the line that has that, as well as the ball chest too. So definitely enough to pose Arthas in just about any way you could imagine the character actually standing or behaving. You won't do anything crazy or dynamic like Illidan, but you don't need to. So the articulation fits the style and visual of the character quite well. Just a few limits, so I would give the articulation about a 9 out of 10. So all in all, this figure is near perfect and accomplishes everything you'd hope to see in an Arthas figure. And in fact, even a little more. This is my favorite Arthas figure to date, and really one of the top figures in my collection, just because I do love the character so much and it was executed so well in this form. And then finally, there was Tyrael. As you can probably tell already from looking at this figure, it is absolutely stunning. Another beautiful example of well executed Heroes of the Storm action figures by NECA. I know it seems like I love all these figures so much, and that's honestly just because I do. They're all really well done, and that's not just a biased opinion as a fan of the game. That's a professional opinion as well. Tyrael sculpt is an easy 10 out of 10. The armor is incredibly detailed and layered. So many different extra pieces, like his shoulder pads here at his waist, and on the back. These are even 2 pieces on the sides. These are little extra pieces glued onto the knee and the ankles as well. So they didn't cut any corners here when it came to sculpt. Plus, everything is just so well done. All the edges are tight and sharp. There's so many different layers and all these different grooves in the armor as well. Somebody spent a lot of time making sure this sculpt was perfect, and it shows. So easy 10 out of 10 on the sculpt for me, including Eldrain's Might, which looks incredibly good too. And it's even a little sharper than most of the swords in the game, so it looks right instead of like a Nerf sword. When it comes to paint, Tyrael is close to perfect. The gold is a great color. The white is nice and clean. There are a lot of little decals here to give his armor all the little glyphs and runes and stuff it's supposed to have. The silver outlines on the gold armor are also very well done. They're typically tight and well defined, if you can see there. There's also, in fact, some shimmer effect to the gold, which is nice because Tyrael is angelic and he's supposed to be glowing and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, some of the applications are a little off. You might notice, if you can tell, the lighting here is not particularly good and seems to be going on me. But the glyphs, like this glyph, is aligned to the right edge of his shoulder pad, whereas this one is kind of in the middle or to the right. So those aren't symmetrical, and it looks a little off. So just some real small mistakes there. Plus, my Tyrael does have a couple instances of messy paint applications. You might notice a little something there, and there's a couple other spots with some scarring. So the paint, unfortunately, has some issues, and I would rate it at an 8 out of 10, but really it's all minor stuff, and all in all, the effect is still glorious. He looks incredible, so it does not really hurt the figure overall at all. And then finally is the articulation. Tyrael has an identical articulation model to Arthas, and in many ways it operates similarly. Sometimes the armor will get in the way, so you can't bend the elbows very much, for instance, just because that armor is so thick and blocks it. His wrists also are pretty limited, but his head can move a fair amount, even though you probably don't need to move it much since it is Tyrael. And his legs are good. I will say that my Tyrael's knee joints are somewhat loose, which is unusual for NECA and the line. So it's kind of flimsy. It's probably hard to show that, but it doesn't give him any problems standing up, but it does make me nervous that over time that articulation might start to loosen even more and make him difficult to pose, particularly in anything dynamic. But just standing straight up and looking like Tyrael for the most part, it gets the job done. So despite the issues, I would still rate it at an 8 out of 10. There are a couple extra things I want to mention about this figure. Tyrael, of course, does float in the game. He doesn't stand up. And this figure doesn't include a stand, and it's also kind of hard to point his feet in a way that makes it look like he's floating. So that might disappoint some people, I recognize, but you can buy pretty cheap stands that are designed to make figures look like they're flying or floating for $5 or so. So if it's a big issue, you can overcome that. Also, you probably noticed Tyrael is missing the big white or bluish glowing wings that extend out of his back, which is honestly a pretty major oversight, because those are fundamental to the look of Tyrael's character in my mind. But they would have been very difficult to design and balance on the figure and include in the packaging. So I don't necessarily hold it against NECA that they left those out, but if you think that that defines who Tyrael is as a character, I wouldn't be surprised if you're a little disappointed. I mean, these look good and they are articulated, these wings. So you can do stuff with them. You could probably even create some custom wings or ask an action figure customizer online to do that for you. So there are some possible solutions there, but in the meantime, I still think it's a pretty fantastic looking figure, and you might just have to use your imagination a little bit. All in all, I love Tyrael's design as a character, and this figure does it justice 95% of the way. So I think you will, in fact, definitely enjoy this figure. Now that you've gotten a closer look at each of the figures individually, you might be wondering what's next, what's in the future of the Heroes of the Storm action figure line. Well, we don't know a ton. The manufacturer NECA has confirmed the next wave of figures. Those will include Diablo as a deluxe figure, and then Sylvanas, Raynor, and Thrall as standard figures, and then presumably what is a 2-pack of Brightwing and Murky. Beyond that, nobody knows what exactly is next. NECA does say that the line is doing well in general, which means they're not planning to drop the line anytime soon. They might be producing figures kind of slowly, but at least we know that more are coming in the future. A lot of people wonder why only 5 figures per year. Isn't that just a ridiculously slow pace? In some ways it is. A lot of lines will produce, 15 to 25 figures per year, depending upon the manufacturer. NECA themselves is kind of stretched thin across a lot of different properties, so they tend to release fewer figures per property per year. That said, I still think it's quite possible that they could eventually move to 2 waves per year. They know the line is successful. They were kind of hedging their bet at first with only 5 figures, but now that they're more confident and can start increasing the pace, we might see 2, maybe even 3 waves per year if we're lucky. And then I also get a lot of questions about Overwatch. Will Overwatch characters join the Heroes of the Storm line? That depends on how many Overwatch characters join Heroes of the Storm, right? We know Tracer is on the way to the game. We would expect additional Overwatch characters will be added to Heroes of the Storm eventually, and my guess is that the NECA license for Heroes of the Storm includes any character that shows up in the game itself. So Overwatch characters are definitely a possibility. Just depends on how long the line lasts, how much foresight NECA gets into future characters, and how many are added to the game in the first place. But Overwatch is a definite yes. And with that, I'd just like to say thanks for watching. My name is Regis Kilbin. You can find me all over the web at Regis Kilbin. Until next time, game on.